Basically, tell the story that you told about what happened that day.
Well, I found myself in a conversation with my wife, and I call it a debate occurred. Some people call those arguments, but it was a debate. And, we both needed to just kind of calm down for a moment. And so I exit our house, and I'm sitting in the front in my car just to kind of process my thoughts and my emotions. I hadn't been moving, so it was no traffic violation that was possible, no rolling stop or anything of that nature, just sitting stationary, kind of gathering my thoughts. And it was in the evening, and a police officer drives by, turns around his car, he flashes a bright light, puts the lights on, and walks up to my car. And the first question he asked me was, "What are you doing in front of this house?" And I remember thinking, this is the house that I own. I worked hard, me and my wife, to be able to buy our first home and have children there, build a family here. And yet the first thing he questions is not, a simple question like, "Hey, is everything okay?" Not a question of inquiry, but what are you doing in front of this house? It was a statement of belonging. And as we began to engage in conversation, he began to ask me for things that I thought were peculiar. And I had a grandfather in law enforcement, so I knew there were kind of strange questions like, "Well, do you have any bill on you that proves that you live here?" And no, I don't walk around with a utility bill in my back pocket. And the conversation continued until I had to prove to him that I lived there by actually walking to my door, putting the key in the door, proving that I actually had access to the home. And I just remember walking into the house, sitting in the foyer for just a few moments before moving around the house, feeling embarrassed, dehumanized, like I didn't belong. Like no matter how hard we worked for it, no matter what kind of future we were trying to build for our family, we didn't belong there. And I talked to a sergeant in that particular police department who raised this question to me. He said, or made this statement to me. He said, "Vernon, there's only one or two reasons that he would have done that. Either he thought you were suspicious, or someone called thinking you were suspicious." And it's these realities that I just think about, and the pain that I felt that day, a lack of belonging, a feeling that I, to someone, looked like a threat. And it didn't matter that I was a pastor. It didn't matter that I was a preacher. It didn't matter that I'm kind. It only mattered what they saw. And that was one of the most heartbreaking moments I can remember of our neighborhood experience.
And what did he see? You said all that mattered is what he saw. What did he see?
What did he see? And I think he saw color. I mean, I think what it boils down to, whether it was him or whether it was the individual who made the call, they saw color. They couldn't have seen anything else.
And there aren't a lot of black folks live in your neighborhood, is that right?
No. Well, we're definitely the minority.
Okay.
We're definitely a minority. We know, and we moved out that neighborhood in part because we're not afraid of color. And I'm sure we'll talk about or allude to my family experience, but we just felt like we want our kids to be exposed, and we want our kids to feel comfortable around other cultures and races, and we want to provide a great future for them no matter where we live at. And so that was a moment that was extremely disheartening, for sure.
One of the things that's so attractive about you to me is when I hear that story. This is not the first time I've heard that story. It makes me so mad. I am so embarrassed that happened to you, and I'm so angry about it. How is it you're not angry about this? Like, how is it that you use words like, "I was embarrassed about it"? How did you get that?
Well, I think there's a few things. Number one, I think it's important to acknowledge, like, my experience is not as unique as people may think. And it also wasn't my first experience growing up with an encounter with the police that one could argue was unnecessary. So I think to many persons of color in America, even friends of mine who reached out about the video, they weren't as shocked because they said, "Been there,
right,
done that." So I think that's one part of it. I also think that, I want to acknowledge that there's righteous indignation that I experience when I see injustice and when I experience my own injustices for our family. But I also really cling to this idea that too many people have endured in years past in history for me to allow my anger to obstruct my purpose. If I do that, then I discredit the work that they did, the water hose, the fires, the water hosing, the dog bites, the jailing, the sit-ins. I do an injustice to the sacrifice that they've already made to allow my anger to compromise my conviction to stay the course. So it's not that I don't get hurt. It's not that I don't even get upset. And I've told another story about my daughter that you've heard before. Now that made me angry.
Just any dad would have been angry.
But I think it's a constant reminder that I believe that this is not just practical, it's also spiritual. And I can't allow the enemy to have victory over what I believe is a kingdom purpose at the end of the day.
So tell us a little bit about your family background.
Wow. So I grew up in a beautifully diverse family. My mom was a part of a family where my grandfather was a white man who married my black grandmother. The first year interracial marriage was legal in the state of Virginia. Wow. She already had 3 black children, my mom of which was the eldest. And then they had 2 children together. So my mom's youngest siblings, my aunt and uncle, are mixed. And then one of my uncles married a woman from Sierra Leone, West Africa, when he was in the military. She migrated here. And another uncle married a woman from Puerto Rico. So I like to tell people Thanksgiving was confusing. And there's a lot going on. But also, it gave me a very early exposure, rich exposure to appreciating culture because they weren't raised in the States. They came into it with a very, rich cultural identity that we all had to learn from them. And then they had to learn from us, and we had a chance to grow together. So that was a great experience. And as a part of that experience, I've had the benefit of hearing my grandparents tell stories about not only being ostracized by the white community, but the black community around them, just kind of feeling isolated in times. I'm actually doing an interview with my grandmother soon about that. And all of the experience when my mixed aunt and uncle, what does it mean to not fit anywhere? And those experiences. Then on my dad's side, also interestingly enough, his father was the first my grandfather was the first African-American colonel in the Hampton Roads Police Department. So he started as a custodian and became the first black, everything in the police department, captain, colonel, everything. And so rich history in law enforcement, but also told me stories of being spit on and beat up in the locker room before a shift, that being discouraged to leave law enforcement, and yet he stayed the course. So that he could open doors for a generation like mine. We were the beneficiaries of his staying put and staying the course. So that's my family background, and it was a great history of seeing people struggle, but also seeing people stand for what mattered. And I learned so much from their example and their witness, and truly inspired me to do some of the work that we're doing today.
And I'm reading this book, I'm trying to take a fresh look at myself. I grew up, my family of origin was super poor, and I caught a lot of the ill effects from friends I went to school with. I went to a school that had people of means, and my family didn't have a lot of means, and so plus I went to a very diverse school. So most of my life, I've never thought of myself as having, I certainly would say I'm not a prejudiced person, but I would actually have said, I don't have those prejudices. But I've been convicted that I need to relook. I need to take a fresh look inside and say, maybe it's there and you just don't see it. So I'm reading this book called White Awake, which I find ironic that's written by a white guy, but anyway. One of the things that he says over and over again in the book is he says, you should not ask the question, white people should not be asking the question, what can I do? And I'm a little confused by that because I legitimately want to help fix this problem where we see each other differently, where unity doesn't exist, which I think should exist in the kingdom of God, where color legitimately should not be a factor in how we treat each other or how we think of each other or how we value each other. So I'm asking you to be honest with me. Is it a bad question to ask, what can I do? And if it is, what question should I ask?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to. Okay. No, honestly, for me, this is my personal conviction, and I don't speak for all African Americans. I know we're not monolithic, but it is my conviction that it is an okay question to ask. I think any other iteration of the question gets us back to the same place. We all have to do something. And I think if we don't want that question asked, I think we miss an opportunity. to find progress. Now, I do understand the heart of the statement, don't ask the question. And if I could probably put some meat on the bone around that. Here's why I think that question often becomes fearful for people of color, because historically, when asked, what can I do? The assumption becomes, what can I own? Right? What can I direct? What can I control?
Okay.
There's a sense that, two things we've seen, I think historically, is one, that if the majority race has access to more influence, power, resources, that they can ultimately dictate how the work happens, how the reconciliation happens, how the change occurs. And I think that kind of perpetuates a theme for people of color. Like, hey, no. We need to be equally yoked in this assignment and in this purpose. We need to have equity in how we lead this thing forward. So when people ask, what can I do? The assumption, I think, or the implication that can be felt through history is, no, what can we do, right? Like, not what can you do for us,
right.
There's also the implication, and again, maybe I'm just painting a picture of what can many times be the assumption, I think, there. An implication that when someone says, what can I do? It's a sense of, let me come and save you, right? And we've seen this both international, missions and even domestic missions, right? It's like, okay, we're going to come in and save all these kids and this work, and we're going to do this. And so I think unfortunately, the question as stated has things written into it that are connected, maybe not to the heart of the question, but to the history of the question. But what I do believe is it is a good question to ask, even if it starts in our hearts and then moves into our habits, is what can I do? What can I do? And I think it's a necessary question. I go as far to say this too. I think that when people talk about being allies or being a part of this work that we're trying to do, and I say we not as Black people, but as human people,
sure.
Right? It's the work that we're doing today and having this conversation, which is being unified. I think we have to start with 3 levels. I think we should start with seeking awareness, right? So before we seek to do, we should seek to learn, right? Like, how do I lean into the lens and the vantage point of another? Like, opening up myself to realizing that their experience may not be my experience in communities, in America, in this and in that. After we seek awareness, right, I think then we have to, acknowledge that awareness, and then we have to make the ask. I often get asked this question about, how do you just walk up to people and say, okay, now what, right? Like, do I just find a Black person to call a friend, or do I just, kind of just show up and like, do I just put out a post on social media and be like, hey, looking for Black friends, and Black people, right? The same, like, hey, man, really gonna befriend some white people so we can change the world. Like, where do we meet at to do that? So I think that what we have to do is make the ask. We have to stop avoiding the awkward and the uncomfortable. Yeah. And we just got to say, hey, look, at some point we got to do that. Now, I think part of what makes that possible is we don't have to always start with the conversation of race. We can also start with the conversation of sports and children and common ground, and build relational foundation that gives us a runway into the weightier matters. I think the way forward is through relationship. And if we can do that, then we can ultimately then seek alignment, which is what you're talking about, right? That's what this conversation is all about. It's like, all right, after awareness, and then after this making the ask, that's what you did today, right? You say, hey, let's have a conversation. Then it becomes, how do we seek our alignment in our lives? Like, how do we say, okay, now I need to diversify my phone log. I need to diversify who my kids play with. I want to make sure my life is aligned with these values that are emerging, and I think that's kind of how we navigate next steps in that question.
So one of the things that happened in this book is the author goes on this journey where he also does some introspection, and he gets there by being asked this critical question. And the question that his mentor asked him was, I want you to write down the 5 authors you read the most, the 5 preachers who are most influential, the 5 coaches in your life who are speaking directly into your life, your 5 closest friends. And there was another category, I can't remember what it was. But anyway, so he goes and he writes all these names down, and he stands back and looks at the list, and everyone on the list in all those categories is all white. And so he realizes that he's not being influenced he doesn't have anybody in his life that is also speaking at any level of diversity. So when you say it begins with relationship, it doesn't always have to start with, it does not have to start with color or race or culture.
Yep.
It begins with relationship. So here's my question.
Yep.
You have a predominantly black church.
Mm-hmm.
I have a predominantly white church.
Yep.
How do we tell the folks in our church how to go get friends in each other's church? Like, how do they do that? Do they just put out a post and say, hey, I don't have any black friends. If you're black, could you just, DM me? I mean,
I think we all have the tendency, a great question, to convene where we're comfortable.
Okay.
Everybody, right? And I also want to give grace to that, right? Like, we work all week. We overthink, did I offend so-and-so? Did I do this? Is my boss pleased with my work ethic, right? And so then Saturday comes and you're like, finally, I don't have to think. Let me just get around some people I can just talk.
Right.
And I'm not trying to process every word and make sure it's strategically said and so forth and so on. I'm not, and I'm not focused on my Enneagram today. I'm just focusing on who I am. And Sunday comes and then we worship in a space of comfort and then we prepare for the week and we jump back into the rat race, right? So I think that there's grace given to that. I think black people do that, white people do that, Hispanic people do that, Asian people do that. Everybody convenes in the place of comfort. And I think that's what has to change. Now, does it have to change dramatically overnight? No. I think it can change little by little. I think that here's a simple practical challenge I've offered to some people in our community. I say, hey, if 1 weekend a month, you say we're going to be intentional, we're going to develop some community that's broadening the bridge and diversifying our context. And we're going to just set, every third Saturday, we're going to get our kids together to play, right? It didn't derail my entire comfort, but it was a practical thing because we schedule what we value. So I think it's those simple, right, like incremental acts of opening up our life that happen. Now, granted, the question still has to happen, right? Like, where do you find those people at? I think it's the practice of proximity. I think, once again, it's about the convening piece, but it's the practice of proximity. Where can I go, right? You can Google best soul food restaurant in the city. 9 times out of 10, there's gonna be some black people there. You know what I'm saying? Like, and so when you pull up, like say, okay, we're gonna frequent this restaurant. We're gonna change our most frequented coffee shop. There's diversity in this coffee shop, and we're gonna be able to now more organically encounter people. We're gonna like alter like 2 weeks. We're gonna let our kids play at this park, and then 2 weeks we're gonna let our kids play at this park that we know is a little bit more diverse in this area in Scott's Addition or somewhere here or somewhere there. And we're gonna just find ways to just practice the proximity work so that we can organically create relationship. For some of us, it'll be a little bit easier. It's a coworker that we can just say, hey, let's go to coffee. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to grab lunch with you sometime. And maybe it's not that. Maybe it's a person at your church who is the minority, right? Like, that they're there and you say, hey, I'd love to get our families together for dinner one Sunday evening. I think we got to look for the opportunities around us and then practice the gift of proximity and let those organically create opportunity for engagement and relationship.
So because we got the opportunity today to have a really honest conversation, and I appreciate you letting me ask these questions, because a lot of people, I suspect this is true in both the black community and the white community, but just to be completely honest, a lot of white folks don't know how to ask these questions. They're afraid that asking the question in itself is offensive. So when I was in seminary, speaking of being intentional about going to the soul food restaurant and frequenting it. Yeah. So when I was in seminary, I decided to take a class at Virginia Union University, which is an almost entirely black school.
Absolutely.
So
I got my MDiv from there.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. So I take a class called Pauline Literature. And I walk in, I'm the only white guy in the class. And the very first class, the professor has us make some introductions, and the other folks in the class, who are all black, basically look at me with, like, all together. They look at me and they say, why are you here?
Why are you here?
Why are you here? Now, they did it politely. Yeah. And I recognized that it was actually a pretty decent question. Like, you don't look like you belong here, so why are you here? And this is what I told them. I said, I recognize I am learning and living in a bubble. And I sure would like to understand better about what your community, particularly in church life, how you see the world and how you think and how you believe, and so that, because I feel like we could do something better together. But I wasn't there. I was there to learn. I wasn't there to. And what was interesting about it is, I think some of my colleagues in that class were offended at first. And then they weren't. But it took some time. The reason I bring it up is because there are a bunch of white folks who are thinking, if we just start going to the predominantly black restaurant, they're going to ask the same question. Why are you here? And some of them may be mildly offended for a while, like you're just trying to patronize us. Is that a risk? And how do we approach that?
Well, I think, all of us, and particularly from a kingdom perspective, want to have to get away from the theological construct that our faith is supposed to be absent of risk. I think that at a core Christian level, Jesus doesn't promise us a life without risk. He promises us, like, carry your cross and rejoice in persecution, and this idea that if we, in the book of James, it talks about, through trial and tribulation, right, come out on the other side more whole. So I think that to model a Christ-like following, we have to not ask ourselves, is there a risk all the time, but is there a reward that expands the kingdom and unifies the kingdom? I think that is a challenge that we all have to accept. And that's black, white, or indifferent, right? Like, black people have to take that risk. Like, we can't just return to our corners and say, we're good over here and you're good over there. I think everybody has to do their part to kind of step beyond the comfort of, we're good over here, and to step into the risk so that we can see the reward of unity and diversity in the kingdom. I think also, too, it's okay to, if this is possible, this is a practical thing, because I think sometimes we can play in the clouds.
Sure.
I think it's okay to practice ambassadorship too. So sometimes I tell people, if you have a person that you can say, hey, I'd love to be exposed to some culture things, or do this or do that, can you take me with you? Right? Because now I'm an ambassador. Now I have an ambassador to the conversation. Now I have an ambassador to the setting and environment. Now I have an ambassador to the community that says, no, this is my man's. I mean, that I had you coming to a staff retreat for us at Lake Anna, which now has been canceled.
Before the whole world fell apart.
Before pandemic. But I was excited to say, hey, white, black, or indifferent, this is a pastor that I trust. I trust his heart. I trust him and his wife's, just love for my wife and I. And then also, I think he has some really great stuff to develop us. But I am an ambassador of your voice to their context. And so I think we got to look for those opportunities as well. Hey, here's what I would say. I'm not saying let's everybody just go find the best black place we can hang out and the best white place we can hang out. Right. Because I've done this. I went to the Country Music Museum, right, to just help me understand this, the country music thing. And now I drive my wife crazy because it's one of my favorite genres. You know what I'm saying? So I say that to say, I think we can say, I can go into space and I can go into place, and even if I don't have ambassadorship, what I can do is just be present. And what we learn from just being present, right, is a gift in and of itself. And here's what I've learned. We're okay accepting being the oddball out, eyes on us when we're in a different country. And we go into different countries and we know we look odd, right? But missions trip oddness, right, internationally is more exciting for us than domestically.
Wow.
So we can go to another country, look around and say, man, people are African, people are European, people are Eastern, Middle Eastern. And but we're here. I know I look weird, but hey, we're here for the gospel. We're here to take the kingdom here. And I just would challenge all of us to have that same courage domestically. Yeah. Right? Yes. Because to your point, yes, does it start with what's going on here? But what will end is a beautiful, flourishing relationship for the kingdom of God.
You were talking earlier about the idea of ownership and not having to control everything. And one of the things you mentioned before the cameras were rolling, so I want to make sure we get this. So one of the things you were talking about earlier was the idea that we can help by coming alongside of some other great things that already exist. one of the questions that I have about that is, there is some fear that if the white church comes in and says, hey, let us help you with this ministry, that it will seem like we're patronizing. When that's not the intent. But if what we mean by what can I do is that we own it and control it, then the alternative is to let us help. But then there's the sort of a little bit of a fear that maybe we're perceived as the, rich white people that want to. How do we avoid that?
So I think a starting point that we have to simply acknowledge is this, that there are people on both extremes. There are absolutely communities, organizations, and even churches of color that are not interested. And I am certain on the other side that there are churches that are predominantly white who are saying we're good and comfortable.
Right.
I think what we're doing today, Life Church, the Bridge Church up the street that I passed, the Passion Community, John Wagland Hill City Church. I just told you I was with Josh Whitlow and Heights Church, and then other friends of mine who pastor black churches. What we're all doing is saying we could do way more together than we could do apart. So now the question becomes, okay, now that we've acknowledged that, we're not talking about the extremes here. We're talking about the people who want to do something together. I do think that it is possible. I think what is important is three things. One, what voices do we elevate? So I think that, we talk about like the patronizing versus we want to come alongside. I think we have to just support equality in what we elevate and what we expose people to. The reality of it is we have opportunity. So you have an opportunity to elevate my voice to a community that I couldn't reach. I have an obligation to elevate your voice to a community that you couldn't reach. Does that make sense? And that's what I mean by, I think that's how we avoid or overcome the question and the challenge of that. I also think it's important when we talk about the ongoing works is that there's growing historical frustration sometimes, if I'm being candid.
Yes, please.
That for many communities of color, white people feel like they have a plan to fix our communities better than we can create. So it's like, we got to change that. I'm heartbroken. We got the resources to do something about that. And with no exploration, with no exposure,
no understanding,
with no proximity, it's like we're going to create a nonprofit and a program to fix that problem that we've never experienced, never talked to them about. And so we're going to this inherent idea that we can fix problems that we haven't experienced, we can fix problems that we haven't been in proximity to. And I think that's what we also, I encourage many times is like, make sure you go through a season of learning and connectivity. And that's what I mean by the allyship. That's what I think is like moves beyond patronizing. Like, no. We're partnering in a legitimate way because we've taken the next few months and the next 6 months to understand where our resources would best be utilized. I give you an example of how this plays out a lot of times. An example could be, people hear about young minorities need educational support. So cool, we could throw money at it from afar. But it's not until you recognize, when we planted our church in 2015, we started at a middle school in inner city Richmond that didn't have central AC. It would be so hot in the summers, right, that the issue would become, we would have to rent portable AC units just to get through service. Several times we had to, cancel service because just the air conditioning units could not hold up to the experience. Right? Fast forward, we live in Chesterfield. They get laptops, right? Students get laptops. Now, everybody's taking the same SOL, equality. But if a kid in Chesterfield public school system is taking that SOL in perfect temperature conditions.
They're comfortable.
And a kid in Richmond inner city schools is taking it without central air conditioning. And it is 95 degrees and they're exhausted and they're sweating. Same test, equal. Circumstances, though, are not equitable. Right? So, give you one more example. I was talking to a white police officer. I had a great conversation with him not too long ago after the Life RVA incident, who acknowledged, and he worked specifically in the criminal division. And he tells this story of one day pulling up on the side of the road because they got a call that, hey, there's all these young black kids sitting on the side of the road up to something mischievous. He pulls up, says, what are y'all doing on the side of the road? And they said, the bus didn't come. So they like, oh, that's crazy. Talked to all the parents. And the parents were like, well, yeah, sometimes it comes and sometimes it doesn't make it. Now, if that were to happen in Chesterfield,
it would only happen once.
It would only happen once. And as a police officer, right, he was like, it helped me to understand the need better. Right, what do we need to do? Do we need to talk about busing? Do we need to talk about buses? Do we need to like finance that? And so I simply say that as it's about understanding the need. Mm-hmm. Let's rally our funds together. How much does it cost to fix the air conditioning units? Right? Because maybe the issue is not a mentoring, a tutoring program. Maybe they are just as academically sound. Maybe they just aren't taking the test in equitable circumstances.
Right. They're just distracted by it.
But if you don't know that, you may invest money into a tutoring program and not an air conditioning program.
Which gets back to your idea of proximity.
Right.
If you're not close enough to it to understand it, then you'll throw a lot of resources at the wrong thing.
Yeah. And again, I just use that as an example.
Yeah, that's a good example.
But I just think it speaks to that heart for what partnership looks like is the proximity, the exposure, and then being able from a vantage point of compassion. And I do believe this. I believe a lot of things we are convicted to a point, right? So I think we are convicted to a point to be contemplative, right? But not to a point to be convicted to a point of compassion to change, right? I think we see this in the Gospels when we see Jesus answer the question, who is my neighbor? And Jesus chooses to answer that question with a parable about the Good Samaritan, which has ethnic implications.
Yes.
We don't, Jews and Samaritans we don't, like a woman at the well, we don't talk to each other.
Right.
And so there's these ethnic implications, but look at what the Samaritan does. Jesus says the Samaritan doesn't just observe the need, doesn't just operate from a contemplative place, and doesn't just use his resources to be like, hey, there's somebody on the side of the road here, you've been beat up pretty bad. If he comes here, here's some stuff to help him get. He comes close too. And he alters his priorities. He alters his privilege. He uses his resources. He uses his presence to get this man to a place of opportunity and the other side of his pain. And so I just think that it's vitally important that we see those pictures, even in the gospel, of what it means for us to, and it's your part, not just patronize, but to say, no, we're really invested, partnered with seeing change happen in our world. Yeah,
the Good Samaritan even puts his credit on the line. I mean, he writes a blank check. It says any expense you incur, I'll cover it.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question about culture, but before I do, I want to just take one slight detour and say I'm the piece you mentioned earlier about the Museum of Country Music. Yeah. I'm glad that you fell in love with country music. Maybe you can educate me, and I can find a way to love it too. I'm just saying.
It's the most beautiful storytelling music ever. Now, I'm a musician.
Whatever you say.
Musician and artist before I was a pastor. So I'm just telling you, there's no storytelling like country storytelling.
Well, that may be true. Now, have I ever told you, did you know, have you not heard me talk about this, that there won't be any country music in heaven?
No.
You don't know that?
No, I didn't know that.
Well, I'll tell you why. Because in heaven, your dog ain't gonna die, your wife ain't gonna leave you, your truck not gonna break down, your house not gonna get foreclosed on, you're not gonna lose your job.
Let me tell you something, but you're gonna still have stories to tell. You're gonna tell back. You're gonna be like, man, when I was back on earth, but there won't be no sad stories.
Yeah, it won't be a sad story. So, you know what they call that? Rock and roll. So just
that's not on my top three, so I don't know. I don't know.
So talk a little bit about culture. One of the things that I think I have struggled with some as I've really tried to reflect on how I think and see the world. The conversation a lot these days, the conversation is about we need to open our culture up within our own subcultures, allowing people from outside cultures to affect and influence the subculture that you're in. And that can take a lot of different forms, but it includes in the church. There's a distinct black church culture, and there's a distinct white church culture. So I part of how I was mentored in ministry was that my job, the senior pastor's job, now this race never came up in this conversation, but what I was taught was the senior pastor's job, you are the protector of culture, which involved a lot of factors, a lot of factors. Yeah. But this new conversation has caused me to think, okay, how much should the church, any church of any kind, how do we decide, and I'm asking this is a vulnerable question as a leader in my position, how do I decide what's immovable part of my culture?
Yeah.
And what should be the flexible, influential, we should take a second look at this part of my culture? How do you answer that as a leader?
It's a great question, a loaded one. So I'm going to get it. This is one of those questions you answer and then on your way home you say, I should have said, why didn't I say this? But here will be my initial thought. I think that part of what we have to start that conversation, all of us, all pastors, and I will be candid and vulnerable with you and let you know I'm even evaluating this in our church. There is a black culture in our church. We have white people in our church, but there is a distinct black culture. And I am reconciling, I don't think our black culture of our church should supersede the Christian culture that Jesus died for.
Wow.
I am reevaluating, have we created a culture that subverts or misrepresents the culture that Jesus died for? In every way. I'm addressing it from the standpoint of our attractional mentality. People come, but the question is, are they really being discipled? Like, are we judging and affirming our success by our seating capacity or by our sending capacity? Like, that's a culture question.
It is.
Because if we start judging our culture by how many people we send and not just how many people we seat, right? It changes the way we do discipleship. It changes how we affirm our success, right? And I'm saying that as a person who loves to preach to a room full of people,
yes,
right? So I get that. But to the specific, thing about how our culture's manifesting that, I think that we have an obligation to protect the gospel culture first and foremost. I personally feel like everything after that is up for a dialogue. Now, here's what I also understand. Every church cannot be all things to all people. I just think, there's a reason why McDonald's and Hardee's and Burger King can exist on every corner in America and never be mad at each other. You know what I'm saying? Because they just know, like, I've got a taste for chicken today, and I got a taste for a Whopper today. I think churches can operate the same way. I think that you don't have to necessarily adjust or alter the entire context of your culture for the purpose of, right? Like, so that all the black people and all the Hispanic people can, no. I think what we need to do is ask this question. This will be my conviction. Do we really operate our churches as independent kingdoms? Or do we have a culture of collaboration where if you like church that's an hour long, this is the church for you, white, black, or indifferent. And if you like church that might go like a couple hours because you don't got a lot going on, then you might want to visit mine. And if you like church that does this, and if you like church that the pastor's a little bit more passionate this way, cool. Because we're preaching the same gospel. The gospel culture is there. But beyond that, how do we collaborate? And how do we say, now, our greater assignment as a culture, every church culture, should be about how do we be a part of, as Micah talks about, do justly, walk fairly, practice humane practices. I mean, those are the type of things I think about our culture that we have to. So I do think like those things need to manifest in our pulpits, no matter whether we're preaching to a congregation of all white people, black people, or Hispanic people. We need to all preach justice, right? I need to preach to the African American community that an agenda that meets the needs of my children matters, but also understanding the Hispanic agenda matters, right? I need to preach to our community that we can't let hate and bitterness, right, impede our ability to be representatives of Christ, building a unified community of white, black, Hispanic, Asian, everybody is his children, all one in Christ, as it says in Galatians. So I think we have to all make sure that our culture has, from the platform to the pew, a value for what the gospel culture is. And then from our independent spaces, we become a part of a larger kingdom, not building our own kingdom. I don't know if I answered that question well.
No, that's a great answer. I really appreciate that.
I think this is really a Rome wasn't built in the day type of situation. And if I'm being honest, I think this is what fatigues a lot of people of color. because the conversation is, but we've made so much progress, but there's still so much more to do. And I will say, I think culturally we've built a culture of immediate gratification. I think that it is a piece by piece thing, because I don't think we're talking about an election by election thing. I think we're talking a generation by generation thing. I really believe that in my heart. When I said I believe that's what fatigues a lot of people of color, it's because I believe there's this feeling that we have to get everything done in the next 4 years, in the next 8 years. And the truth of the matter is, and I know you look like you're about 32 years old, you know, I
really appreciate
it. But your years of life, right? Things that you've learned, values that you've built won't be changed in a year or two, right? But what we can do is hope to instill values in every generation that's coming after us that further bridges, further creates proximity, and ultimately further opens us up to me, people will vote differently when they live differently. So when I tell the story of my daughter, which I posted a video about, who was attacked at her school for the color of her skin. A little boy and a little girl choked her, pulled her hair, and then they said, you know, when asked, why did y'all do that to her? And the bus driver confirmed the legitimacy of this story. They said, well, because she looked different. When that story is heard, it doesn't matter whether you're a black parent or a white parent. All parents want to protect their children.
That's right.
So now we have to ask ourselves, systemically, right? What do we want to change generation by generation so that little black kids and little white kids, right? We're not talking about this in the 60s, we're talking about this in 2020. Grow up having a value for each other's, the things that matter to them culturally. I think that the assumption becomes whenever we start talking red and blue, we assume we're all so far apart. And if you look at the facts, I think what you start to find is that we don't disagree on as much as we think.
Yes.
But the things that we do are really more, in my experience, a lack of exposure and interpretation.
Yes.
Than anything else.
I completely agree.
Yeah. And so I think that's a valuable part of how we move forward. But I do think it's generation by generation. I think what we'll see systemically is my grandfather overcame systems so that my generation could have certain benefits. The question I have to ask myself is what benefits will my grandchildren have as a result of my boldness and courage today?
Which is not immediate gratification, because some of those things you will not get to experience, but generations that come after you will get to experience. Those kids that bullied your daughter, they learned that somewhere.
Absolutely.
And my guess is, in fact, I don't know any of the personalities involved except your kids, but I can say, I'm pretty sure about this. If you ask those people, they would all say, we don't see people differently. Or, I'm not a racist. Or, I don't have prejudice. Because it's so embedded in us. We don't see it, which is why I think it's required for us to step back and say, hey, and I think being the multi-generational thing, I'm a big fan of family systems. I've studied it for a long time. And I think every family ought to do this. You've talked about how your grandfather, his experience, and out of his experience, he shared things with you that were totally legitimate based on his experience. I had to both understand and undo what happened in my family. I remember talking to my great-grandma Hughes. I walked in to see her one day. My family grew up in this little town called Hosky, North Carolina. Walked in to see her one day, the door was locked, and she lived in the middle of nowhere. Like in the middle of nowhere. And I said, Grandma, why you lock the door? It's a big farm. She's surrounded by, 100 acres, whatever. And this is what she said. Well, of course I locked the door. You never know when a black man's going to show up. That's exactly what she said. And I remember that. I was probably 9 or 10 or something. I remember that conversation to this day because it was so startling to me. Because the school I went to was diverse. So it didn't, I did not understand that at all. But it happens. Still happens.
Still happens. And I think what you just said is a beautiful, maybe beautiful is not the right adjective to choose, but a accurate picture of why this conversation is important. Because I think for some, we're like, okay, we went through that season already. Like, do we have to keep talking about this? Right? Like, why are we still talking about this? Well, we're still talking about it because you had the ability to take that information and at some point in your life, process it, filter it appropriately, and not make it create in you a way of thinking that changed the course of your life. But everybody didn't.
Right.
Like, some people heard something like that, and then their ethos about life from that day forward was a perception about color.
Yes.
I think once we just can acknowledge that, right, both ways. I think we said this, we were talking before we started rolling the camera. I have to acknowledge, like, you acknowledge, like, okay, you had a grandmother say one thing. I had a grandfather say, don't trust no white people. If I told my grandfather I was in this house right now, in Powhatan, with a white people around me, he would have a panic attack, right? Because he was beat up by white people and he experienced oppression and discrimination and threats. So for him, protecting us was instilling a fear in us, yes. Right? And here's what's funny. My parents separated several times before they eventually divorced. Had a great relationship, parented us well, but they just, their marriage was kind of in and out. And so I told you, like, I had my white grandpa, right, who we would always go and live with those grandparents whenever my parents would separate and eventually divorce. And then I had my black grandfather who grew up, right, like getting oppressed before he became a law enforcement captain. But he was like, hey, don't trust white people, and I leave his house and go home and live with a white man. I was confused, right? I recognized it was just fear. It was fear, and it was all that he knew. And I think that we have to acknowledge that wasn't that long ago. And I talk to people who say racism doesn't exist, or why are we still having this conversation? I say, if my grandfather who raised me was from the generation who was abused, oppressed, and threatened, then it is safe to assume somebody who doesn't look like me was raised by the grandparent who did the oppressing.
There you go. That's right.
And so here's what I want to do as a bridge builder. I want to give grace to everybody. To say this is not about, this is about all of us being open to me being a learner, to others being a learner, about what we can do to understand each other. Because in many ways, I think we all want safety of our children. We all want better economies. We all want jobs. We all want stability. I think it's these small windows and lenses that we can look through to be like, okay, how can we all then be in alignment so that we honor each other as a people, as a human people, for the future that we want to create for our families.
That's an awesome way to end.